Welcome back to the Wallace branch, and today we're going back to Trainz and getting started on both scenery and track layout. I first just want to show the initial process of texturing, starting over on the east side of the route near De Borgia and Haugen. Surveyor 2's scrapbook is great for texturing scenery, especially large swaths of forest and fields. I don't think you could use the paintbrush to paint on anything like a town, such as is demonstrated in N3V's video that introduced Surveyor 2 scrapbook tool, but for this stuff, the scrapbook paintbrush really shines. True, when you use a large brush like I'm showing here, it does get a little bit laggy, and so usually end up just painting one circle, moving the mouse, as opposed to kind of holding down the mouse button. Anyway, it's still a great improvement over Surveyor 1. In this episode, the route has been converted to HD terrain, and currently HD terrain has a texture limit of just 16 textures. And I thought, well, that might be no problem, but actually it's incredibly constraining and frustrating. I thought that given that around 75% of the map is forest, it would be kind of no problem to have like 6 textures for my default forest ground areas. Even that proved to be too many. There are just a lot of baseboards in the end where I believed I had plenty of extra slots left, but Trainz would just notify me on screen that a texture had been replaced, and there's no way to monitor or check how many textures are on a baseboard. Texture replacement on HD either doesn't work, or maybe the one that has been introduced, it replaces the texture across the entire route as opposed to on a single baseboard. I'm not sure since I haven't dared to try that out. Anyway, when a texture is replaced, there's really no way to know which one was replaced or where it was replaced, other than knowing that the system uses the least used texture. It replaces the least used texture on that baseboard. That's the one that will disappear. And, that could be just one little driveway or one little detail in a yard area. So it might be quite a difficult time to try to suss that out. And unfortunately, N3V seems like they're not really considering increasing the texture limit, and this is going to remain a major limitation of the HD system as of mid-2024. Next, I put in the highway, and I also off-camera added barbed wire and power poles. Today, this highway no longer exists. It was replaced by the interstate, and I don't think that the interstate exactly followed the same path of the original highway in most places. And as I was putting that down, especially here near the Borax Tunnel, I had to leave space for the stream at the bottom of the valley. Even with HD terrain, I think it's tricky to make all of it fit and look realistic and make the slopes look normal. And without HD terrain, I don't think it would be feasible at all to do this area like this. For the highway, I went back and forth on where to place it and what grade to have it follow up to Lookout Pass. It's a very steep grade, as you can clearly see. And then down here closer to Taft, I had a lot of fun deciding the winding path for the highway to take, and in some places I had it follow or even parallel the track, and then in some places I left a big empty area and moved it over onto the other side of the valley. For bridges, as you can kind of see, I found it a little bit tricky sometimes to join up the spline points here and there. Some of the curves on the highways are also very tight, but from the track, you basically don't really notice that, I don't think. For the stream, I created a new PBR texture and also a spline asset that I thought might make it easier to create a consistent grade for the stream and make it easier to kind of level the ground along the stream. But after a lot of fiddling, I realized this just wasn't working at all. And I started using the terrain height tools. I thought that was just actually, in the end, more efficient. I went back later and I boosted the height of the rocks inside this PBR texture to make them pop out more. And so when you're really close in, you can see how the rocks are poking out of the water, which is one of the benefits of the PBR system. And here's where you can see that I was in transition, using some of the stream bed splines to create the initial stream bed in the terrain, but then giving up, deleting the spline, and making a new stream bed with the ground set height tool, and then painting the texture instead of using the spline at all. For the banks, it's an iterative process of getting the banks right, leveling up, leveling down, changing the water level, and so on. Unfortunately, the problem of moving HD terrain really affects the appearance of the stream and water in general. As you zoom in and out, or if you just approach the slopes while following the train that's passing through the scene, as you move around, the HD terrain adjusts to remove the rendering load on the computer, but you'll notice that the water in the stream either just disappears completely or the water completely overflows everything, and it looks horrible from the distance, which kind of negates the benefit of the HD terrain system somewhat. I would ideally like it if there were like a way to adjust the distance when the HD terrain starts to drop in resolution detail, either across the entire route or for your entire Trainz installation maybe. Or what would be even better would be if you could somehow just paint like a heat map of locations, maybe a limited number of spots where on a very large map, that HD terrain resolution needs to stay higher, more consistent because it's highly visible from the track, highly noticeable from the track as you're running through the layout. Maybe right along the right-of-way, such as the slopes, the embankments of the right-of-way itself, or just a steep slope of a mountain that happens to pass right by the track, or in this case, this stream bed where it crosses near the track. And some veteran route creators have also complained about this issue, but I sense that they sort of run up against a brick wall that kind of N3V consider that moving HD terrain is just not a very big issue. And I think that's kind of unfortunate given how noticeable it is. So that's my second complaint about HD next to the texture limit. As an experiment, I created a little section here of stream and then some test textures, also some shrubs and grasses to see how that looked. The textures I ended up keeping, although I went sparingly with the boulder texture later on, and then for the shrubs, I ended up paring back that a lot and not using some of the ones that you see here. Next, I plopped down the first asset of my own creation, not the first asset that I ever created for Trainz, but the first of my own assets to go into this route, which just happens to be this wooden canoe, which is paddled by Matt Damon and a friend. And I also created some backpacks to fill up the canoe so it's not quite so obvious that it's filled with water. And then I put down these freight train assets, some boxcars, some Northern Pacific GP units, and here's the first freight train passing through the route. As you can see, I wanted to test the frame rates a bit, and it was a little disappointing to see the resulting FPS here, but I really found that it gets a lot better after the route is sort of in memory somehow. Now we're jumping to the heart of the route to get started on Wallace itself, and here I was admiring kind of how the default green grass texture clips through the UTM tiles at different zoom levels. I figured it would be fastest to just paint this all with the Toomey Airport texture because it's all going to be city and the city streets are probably the dominant type of texture for the area. Also, I adjusted the Toomey Airport texture to have a height of 0 so that it wouldn't clip into tracks or roads on slopes at any point. That has a downside in that cars or buildings and streets placed on the texture, they appear to float unless you adjust them downward, at least when you're zoomed in to the maximum level. But generally, you really don't notice that unless it's a scene where you are up very close, so I mostly didn't need to make those types of adjustments. I laid down a few of the sidewalks around the blocks, kind of as a guide for future building placement. And as you can see, I was just eyeballing this. They're all crooked, and rest assured that later I came back and laid them out perfectly parallel, and I also widened them a bit to match the reality in Wallace as well. For Wallace, I started with just correcting those original 3 tracks alongside the depot, plus this 1 track into town with a spur, and a track that goes up the little valley alongside the depot. I did the highways and tracks between Wallace and Mullen, and I added a little siding at the town, or maybe it was a former mine location called Grouse. There was a siding here that was marked on the NP timetables that I'd found online. Later, I realized that I placed the NP siding actually on the UP side, in other words, on the south side of these 2 tracks. So later I had to come back and adjust that and put it on the NP side instead. Arguably, making these tracks perfectly parallel, that's not prototypical. I didn't have any map to base this on, and I also figure that in the end we'll end up kind of treating the UP and NP as double track for operating purposes. For the tracks leading into Wallace from the east, where the NP and UP branch lines to Burke connect, I based this on a Sanborn map of the area. It's really nice to have that Sanborn map because this is a very complex track layout, and it's definitely not very clear in some of the photos, the Barnard Stockbridge photos. But much later, after I had put these tracks down, I found an old slide that my dad took during the filming of Heaven's Gate in 1979 that shows the movie locomotive waiting on the tracks just at this spot outside of town. And I think it's really interesting that this track layout was still in place then, that the both UP and the NP tracks up to Burke were still present at that late date, just before the closure of the Wallace line. With the crossovers and the steep slope on the branch line heading up to Burke, it was more than a little bit fussy getting the terrain smooth under these tracks. I'm only going to show part of that here. Um, so next, placing down the depot asset. This was a momentous occasion for me, not because the depot itself took so much time to create, but rather because this depot really is kind of the centerpiece of the layout, and placing it down is kind of symbolizing the commitment to finishing the layout in the first place. And it's also the first time really getting to test the dimensions of a building asset in the real scene of the Valley of Wallace. And my first reaction was, you know, look how small it is. How can it be so small? Can that be right? And I feel that it's partly an optical illusion, like you can't really see the scale at all. When the map is empty, you're building the track layout, and you naturally tend to view everything from a higher zoom level, and you don't realize the scale. There's nothing to set the scale in your mind. Once the map is populated and you're in operating mode, it's more common to be closer to ground level, and it's also easy to see the scale of different objects and compare. They look more realistic inherently once you have more assets down in the scene. In addition, the real life depot is actually pretty small as depots go. It's not a large asset in reality, but it does seem smaller when the map is empty like this. The yard is mostly based on USGS maps, but I did find this one photo of a flood in Wallace that maybe happened in the 1940s, and that photo appears to show a very substantial yard ladder for both the NP and UP parts, and tracks also indicate some sort of interchange right at the beginning of the yard. The photo also has a big vacant area alongside the river, but anyway, this one photo isn't enough to base everything on, so I more went with what I saw on two USGS maps, including this one that shows the turntable and roundhouse on the NP side. You can see me here really struggling with doing track layout in Surveyor 2, and since I made this, I now know a lot more about how to do this efficiently and cleanly, using the control key and the mouse to duplicate and create parallel tracks with the horizontal movement aspect of the gizmo tool, and also using the method shown by Approach Medium of how to do yard ladders. He has a great tutorial on that, which I had previously seen, but I kind of somehow forgot how to do those. I came back and cleaned all of this up off camera, but yeah, here's where the initial layout got set. Here is where I'm just starting with some of the lead tracks on the NP side into what will be the Hercules Concentrator mill. But coming back to this side, I modified a turntable asset that I found on the DLS. I made it longer, I changed the ground textures, and I added this frame on top, making it into a very typical turntable asset that I saw pictures of in Missoula and places like that. Now this turntable that I've made, it's long enough to take the longest Class Z Mallet locomotives that the NP used as helpers on the Wallace branch, and then also the roundhouse I created will fit them as well. Turntables work better on HD terrain, so with all my complaining that you heard before, this is one definite positive of HD. You don't need to create a huge dig hole now. You don't need to constrain the location of the turntable to fit the dig hole location. You don't need a dig hole at all. And then with no dig hole, you don't need a huge apron or skirt around the circular pit to hide that square dig hole. And you don't need the mesh to have any ground at the bottom of the pit even. You can just texture the inside and surroundings however you want. You can mix dirt and ballast if you want, or grass or whatever. And you can add other assets like grass or junk or stains at the bottom of the pit like you would see in real life. Yeah, as I put down the tracks, it's kind of funny, but at several points you'll see this one sign popping up by accident, and it's the first sign in alphabetical order, or the first scenery asset in alphabetical order because it starts with a number. That's the only reason this sign keeps appearing for no reason. Yeah, so I mentioned the roundhouse. I created this roundhouse for the Northern Pacific. Maybe the colors aren't that great or the texture is not that great. I might improve this a little bit in the future, but I'm satisfied for an initial start at least. And I made this long enough so it can just barely fit those Class Z Mallet locomotives. The dimensions are tight, so it has to be right next to the turntable, and the track clearances are a bit narrow. Unfortunately, the steam does go through its roof, even though I did create a collision box for the asset, and for that, I went through a bunch of tutorials online, and I also went onto Discord and I asked for any solutions there. I got a really nice reply from Zek, but I still haven't managed to get that asset fixed. Who knows? Maybe somebody watching will have a suggestion there. I don't know. I also had an actual blueprint for the UP roundhouse that existed in Wallace, so I added a turntable for the UP side as well. For the UP turntable, I used a smaller turntable, also my own edit of that same DLS asset, and then later I went back and reduced the size of the skirt around the pit. Just for fun, I put down some UP locomotives here. I think they're from the DLS or maybe packaged, I'm not sure, but it's just lovely and amazing how putting down a few locomotives makes that scene appear more real, even though the whole valley is still an empty canvas, basically. And then next, to give an idea of where the yard buildings would need to go, I began to rough in the stream bed that passes through town. And then just where the tracks branch off towards Burke, there were these couple of spur tracks I mentioned leading into the Coeur d'Alene hardware warehouse. That warehouse still exists. And then there was another spur that goes into town, passing right behind the county courthouse and up alongside some sort of concrete grain elevator. I'm not sure what that actually was. Anyway, it wasn't just Burke that had tracks going up the street. Wallace did too. Very short tracks, maybe only enough for 2 or 3 cars to load and unload. And then just above those spur tracks, there's another spur I'm creating to service what was, back in the day, marked on the Sanborn map as a lumber mill or something like that. For this layout, I think it's going to be more of a lumber storage area or warehouse, not a full lumber mill like for bringing in logs and then taking out lumber. I decided to add some more modern looking loco or maintenance sheds for the UP side, as well as a few industrial buildings. None of the buildings that I'm placing have any particular intended function. And here, as I work a little bit more on the track layout, you might spot my green measuring tool. I'm thinking it's going to pop into view a few times. I'll just explain that I basically created this set of 2 rectangles to illustrate the separation of the yard tracks in Kickstarter County. The narrowest one and the widest one. So in reality, I think the narrow one is probably even pretty wide by prototype standards for yard tracks, but I mostly use the wider one because for some reason in Trainz it looks nicer to have a nice spacious wider yard layout, and it certainly makes any curves easier too, since they are obviously going to have clearance and everything. But yeah, I think I didn't want any yard layout or siding to be spaced more widely than that wider rectangle. The Hercules Mill was a huge building to the west of Wallace. It was situated on the side of the mountain. It's not exactly obvious where it was or how the ore bins connected to what I think were both some narrow gauge tracks and also an aerial tramway, which I think just went over the mountains up to the Hercules mine, which is about 8 miles away on the mountains above Burke. There's actually an older aerial tramway asset that's on the DLS, and I just reskinned that. You're not going to see that here, but I put it there. And also, I created my own narrow gauge track, and of course, the Hercules mill itself. Surprisingly, the Sanborn maps cover a lot of things, but there wasn't a Sanborn map of this Hercules complex. I don't know why. So I just eyeballed the dimensions from 2 or 3 photos of the mill. I started also making the whole mill with PBR and M glass windows. I wanted it to have nice corrugated metal walls that would have reflections, but then I ended up coming back and un-PBRing the walls because the textures were just creating too much odd reflection and glare. You may be able to spot that weird reflection here and there. I'm not sure if that's visible here, but anyway, I ended up going back and changing the asset to make it just a one text asset. I also moved the mill back and forth to get the position right based on eyeballing the photos and then the USGS map that shows the mill, but it's pretty fuzzy. It's pretty uncertain exactly where it was. At the end of that, after placing the mill and seeing kind of how much area I had left to cover, I kind of decided to wait for a little bit more inspiration on this area. I think the final result of the yard is excellent, and then the interim results that we're seeing today, they're already a good start. It's important when you're modeling to know kind of when to stop for a while, when to take a break, when to come back for more inspiration. In this build, I'm not going to do that very often, but this time it was necessary. I put down this kind of orange-looking dirt road asset with the intention to maybe reskin that or something like that, but it really doesn't match, and what I ended up doing was just replacing it with plain dirt texture and just using texture on the ground instead of an actual spline asset. But I did add some tire tracks splines to that later. Here I'm putting down just a few random industrial buildings, and as you can see, I'm testing out different assets to see how they might look in this scene, and some of it's a bit frustrating to watch. because I was still learning Surveyor 2, and this is about where I realized that aligning different buildings is easiest by kind of dialing in the orientation by typing it into the information box, info box, instead of manually eyeballing the orientation and lining it up with other buildings, turning the asset around with the gizmo. Once I placed down the silo assets, you'll notice that I had already figured that out then. Um, some of the industry building assets that I went through and looked at, they are really nice, especially the JR industry buildings. But for any route creator or city builder program that you might play, you do sort of quickly tire of putting down even the nicest packaged buildings because they kind of remind you of other routes or builds that you've created. And of course, on this route, I did use plenty of packaged or DLS assets, but and especially those JR industry assets are great. But for this part, I just decided it wasn't going to quite cut it. So I did come back later and do one of my own. Actually, I took a trip to the Docklands in London where I attended a conference. And during lunch, I took some photos around some warehouses there. And then that same day, I went home and created a little industry in Blender just to fit the spot on the UP side, where I imagine there could be like a little TUFC loading spot. And I think Wallace can be kind of a staging area for lumber and pipes that are coming in from off the map, from out of town at least, and then heading to the mines. Um, Now I'm coming back to that little spur track and leveling the ground just a little bit, knowing that that will probably create issues. Any place where there's a slope inside the town of Wallace will create issues because the buildings all just have flat ground levels. So you don't want them to be on a slope. I'm also raising the level of the town to be even with the tracks, even though that's actually higher than what exists in reality. I'm trying to make it as level as possible in town for the buildings, just to make it easier on myself. Any slope I hope to constrain to the residential parts or else to the parts that are near these spur tracks where I don't see how that can be avoided. Um, Next, I started putting down my first little spline embankment asset along the stream, and this was a little concrete wall that I created for the channel through town. Nowadays, there's no such wall along the Coeur d'Alene, but maybe in an earlier era there was such a wall based on some photos that I've seen. It was very, very fussy getting the terrain to match the height of the sidewalk of the spline, but I still think the spline helps create a unified scene in this area. I also realized after I marked down the initial placement of the stream that the UP depot was somehow going to have to fit into a slot here by the tracks. And actually, not only that, it seemed amazing that there was actually a track that went around to the other side of the depot between the depot and the stream. But somehow it actually all does fit, and not only does it fit, but actually, I'd say the tight spaces make it look pretty good, pretty prototypical. The photos of the depot show that there was at one time a kind of covered passenger platform that extended out to the west, or what I'd call maybe the front of the depot. But I decided to put more like a parking lot on that side, which might represent how the depot looked towards the end of its life when it was more of an office and maybe just a small freight house that was used occasionally. It's sort of funny watching the time lapse here of putting down this track because just in this one episode, you can see that my track laying skills around the depot area have already improved from the first part of the video where I was putting down the yard tracks. I think that's kind of funny. Now I'm just checking the alignment of the stream with the modern stream. They won't be exactly the same because the interstate's construction, I think, it relocated the stream here and there, made it closer to the town, basically. Um, and I'm zooming down to the bottom of the stream to make sure that there aren't any gaps between the stream bed and the bottom of the concrete wall spline. Here, I noticed in this one spot, the the spline actually has some gaps where the mesh didn't have enough segments for curves, or the curve segments didn't match. So I went in and edited that. It probably took less than 60 seconds to fix that one. As I level the ground up to the edge of the sidewalk, you can really see how the PBR stream rocks pop out of the ground. When I add in the water, you start to see how the PBR stream rocks also pop out of the water, at least at a good zoom distance. For efficiency's sake, I thought it would be good to put down the huge water area, flooding the tracks in the yard area, and then adjusting the water height downward so that it creates a slope. I'm not really sure that was the right method. You have to be careful when putting down water generally, because then sometimes you accidentally discover where there were some places that you didn't intend, or even on the track where there's suddenly a big blob of water sticking out of the terrain. Even through the town, the elevation of the stream bed goes downhill quite a bit, and so that makes it challenging to get the water level right. And basically that challenge continues throughout the entire route. The stream just continues changing elevation as it goes downhill. It's a very steep slope in general. So with 67 miles of stream to adjust and fine-tune the embankment and everything, that was one of the major tasks. Took actually days to work on that. Not something that you're going to want to see even in time-lapse, I would say. Now, just doing a little minor texturing to get ready for the first train in Wallace. Not going for perfect here, just trying to get a little bit of background textures onto the hillside. And of course, we need the lines of the roads that go past the depot. I often, not always, but often start with the basic highway asset to get those widths correct, although sometimes I also just paste it as a scrapbook asset. I know this is where most people prefer the big white circles of splines had in Surveyor 1, but I like the new way actually better. I hate those huge circles. It really makes it hard to see a lot of times. And I know that in Surveyor 1 you can make them disappear, but usually you don't do that. You just leave these huge circles spinning on the map when you're in spline mode. I don't like that. Across the route, I'm relying heavily on some Old West assets that are on the DLS, and especially for simple things like the boardwalks that I used for most of the depot platforms. I also adjusted the color of those Old West assets, and I created a bunch of similar textures that I used for my own use for buildings, small sheds, and things like that. It's just a really high quality texture. For the depot, we need some luggage, including some high-end luggage stacks that I created myself for an old-timey feel. Some of those stacks were from images that I had from over a decade ago when I was actually thinking of using some old luggage as a decoration for my apartment, which I never ended up doing that. So it's kind of neat to see these stacks exist in the virtual world instead. And some of the luggage is from the DLS, and it doesn't look that great. It has some weird pink colors and also some flickering due to some Z fighting in the mesh. I promise that I replaced those assets. I didn't end up using them in the final. I put down some modern people here, but they are going to be replaced when we start going back in time for that old time feel. And that's a wrap for this episode of Building the Wallace Branch. I hope you found it enjoyable and also that you learned something new. Next time, we'll be picking up where we left off by tackling the residential area of Wallace and also the lumber area I mentioned east of town. So if you'd like to join, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you again next time on the Wallace Branch.